Great. Well, thank you, and pleased to be here today. We have the second in our series of outstanding guest speakers for our course, and today I'm very pleased and very honored to have Azim Ramelize with us today. He's the Assistant Commissioner at the Department of Family and Support Services in the City of Chicago. I'd ask you to go to cityofchicago.org and find Family and Support Services to find out what the department does and the work it's engaged in. It's critical to our conversation this week about community engagement. It's a great follow-up to our hypothetical on community capacity building, and I want you to have a good look at that. Azim is a great speaker and a great friend. We've worked on issues together, and I think that our conversation today will hopefully lead you to do some thinking about how we take this concept of community and how we work with our community partners in very difficult and strenuous situations. I think Azim will give us some great insight into that. As you listen to my interview with Azim, please keep in mind that I want you to pull out the nuggets for an essay and really key in on those things that Azim highlights and with some of the questions that I'm asking. So I look forward to seeing your essays, and Azim has even said that he'll take a look at some of them too to kind of get some insight back on how he does. But I think you'll see that Azim is a true leader and has some great things to share with you. So enjoy the interview.
I'm from Brooklyn, but I was born in Trinidad. I came to this country when I was 11. I got involved in a street gang growing up in Brooklyn, and at 17 I got shot in the back. After I got shot in the back, I stayed in the hospital for a year. Couldn't pee, couldn't sit up, couldn't go to the bathroom, laying there trying to figure out what to do with my life. During that year, I must have lost, I think, about 15 to 16 friends from gunshot wound. Crack had hit the streets of New York, and people were just killing themselves left and right. And so I decided that I was going to do something with my life, that I was just not going to waste my life away. And I went back to high school. At that time I used to wear braces. Now braces have just been revolutionized, but at that time they were iron braces. You used to have to lock them at the knees, lock them at the waist, lock them at the ankles, and walk with them. And went to high school like that, and probably was the hardest thing I did, because you're 17-year-old, going to high school, you want to look cool, and you want to sort of stand out, but you don't. You're in braces, and we were placed in this class separate where all the people with disabilities were, and that didn't sit well with me. And I just decided that what, I was going to blaze my own trail, and I was just going to always say what I meant and do something with my life and get out of Brooklyn. And so graduated from high school, went to the Borough Manhattan Community College, made Dean's List every semester, decided, I want to go to an Ivy League school. At that time, I didn't even know what an Ivy League school was, and, going in high school, I had teachers who said, if it was up to me, people like you shouldn't be here, you should go learn how to, fix watches. Well, I got to community college, it was the same thing, people were saying, I think you should go become a bookkeeper or something. And I just looked at them and I said, no, this is not what I want to do. So I had this counselor, which is why I do the work today. I told her that I wanted to go to community college, and she actually sent me to this business school to see how well I can do, to see if I was smart enough. When I made the highest grade in the business school, she had to send me to community college. I went to community college, made Dean's List every semester, and I decided, I think I want to go to an Ivy League school. I applied to about 4 of them, got into all 4. I went to Cornell, loved the environment, and I choose Industrial and Labor Relations. 2 reasons. One is the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell is probably the best school in the country for Industrial and Labor Relations. They churn out lawyers. 80% of the people there go to law school. And the other reason is because I wanted to come out and unionize the world. I had this thing about, everybody being treated fairly and equally. And growing up watching my mother and father work really hard, and having people who just making so much money and didn't care about looking around them to see how the rest of the people was doing. It just really bothered me. So I got out of that actually and realized that I had all these loans and I wanted to make money, so I went to work for Time Life. I handled their profit sharing plan. I was making plenty money, but I was turning around, and every time I turned around I was losing another friend, so I just decided, I was gonna do what I wanted to do, and I applied to law school, and I got into Loyola in Chicago, and I wanted a small school. I didn't want a big school because Cornell is huge. And so I came here and graduated from law school here, and And Janet Reno came, interviewed me, hired me, and gave me a job as a prosecutor in Miami. But when I got to Loyola here, I just thought, I had this Ivy League degree, law school was going to be easy, and I didn't really work hard that first semester, and I flunked, and so, after I flunked, they called me up and they said, you need to reapply. So I reapplied, and I told them, I said, I'm like one of those punching bags. I don't know if you ever see when you're young, you have these things that you punch and they fly back up at you, I'm going to be a lawyer either here or someplace else. But Loyola was pretty good. They let me in. I graduated on time, graduated damn near almost at the top of my class, and that was all she wrote, and it's a little bit of my story.
So when you got to Chicago, was it kind of like that Stevie Wonder song? It's like Chicago, just like I pictured it.
New York is just like I pictured it. Chicago is it's Chicago has more law schools than any other city. It's an intellectual town, probably a little bit more intellectual than New York in that it's flat, and the university is around. In New York, you sort of have to go to different communities to try to find this university setting. So Chicago is different that way, and a little bit more quieter, than New York. So.
Yeah. So how did you translate that law degree and that kind of educational attainment that you had into this to working on your passion on working in the community and working with the community?
It's funny. I just happened on that. It wasn't something I was thinking about. My whole thing was defending people, right? Because when you're a lawyer, if I'm defending Andre is my client, and he's the only one I owe an obligation to, And so I was defending many Andres, but I wasn't really reaching a whole population of people. So, there's this guy in Orlando, and his name is in Florida, his name is Frank Orlando. Really well noted in the juvenile justice community. I was on the Florida Needs of Children's Commission, and at the time what Florida was doing was looking at changing the laws as they applied to kids throughout the state. So I got on that commission, and Frank nominated me for this fellowship at the Casey Foundation. Casey is the guy who founded UPS, and before he died, he wanted to do something with his money, so he left $3 billion to this foundation, and at the time, UPS had not even gone public. It was still privately held. And so what happened was, he nominated me because you can't just go and apply for it. Someone has to nominate you. And I got nominated, and I wrote a letter, and I got accepted. And basically, it's a fellowship about leadership, because the idea is that leaders aren't born. People have to learn how to be leaders. There are very few natural-born leaders, and there is a theory about leadership. So what the fellowship is all about is teaching you about organizations, teaching you about how you come into an organization and change it, but also teaching you about what good leaders are and how they behave. And they spend $1 million on each of us for the year, and we travel the country looking at different leadership style, leadership people, going to different seminars. So the whole fellowship is about leadership. So, after that, I said, what, I want to come out, and I don't want to really defend one person, one person or one individual. What I want to do now is set up programs that touch people across the board and massively. And so I applied for this job, with my commissioner, Mary Ellen Caron. At the time, she was building a new department in the city of Chicago. Mayor Daley had separated youth issues from seniors issues from homeless issues, and she was to head this department. And so, I interviewed for her with this job of building this case management system for the Juvenile Intervention Support Center, and she hired me, and that's how, I ended up doing this work. But the passion started when I was defending juveniles in Florida, really, because they were arrested for stuff that people should not be arrested for. They were getting juvenile records, and these kids, it's not a jury trial, it's a judge trial, and I think it's the worst system in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. So you've taken that passion, and you've really been working on some very specific issues around juvenile justice and community capacity building, and I want to just ask you a question about when you had this leadership training, and it sounds great and sounds like some of the stuff I'm trying to do with this class, so I'm really excited to talk to you more about that offline. But when you had this theory, you went around and saw all these examples, and then when you started working, in the communities. At that time, it was Department of Children
it's Department of CYS, Department
Children
of
and Youth
Services.
Children and Youth Services. So when you started working with community members and in the community, what were the greatest challenges? Was it the way that you expected it to be, or where were some of the?
Well, there were a ton of challenges, but I think the first thing about leadership is what? You can ask leaders a ton of questions about this, and you'd get a ton of different answers.
That's right.
But anybody know anything about leadership is the first thing about leadership is that smart leaders hire smart people. Right? I mean, that's the first rule about leadership. And the second rule about leadership is smart leaders hire smart people and get out the way. Right? And I can show you any organization where you have people that are smart, but they're not smart leaders. There's a difference. And you hire people that are smart, that can do the job, and you step out the way and you don't micromanage. I have that kind of boss now, right? I mean, and it's been great for me, because the work that an organization does is an extension of their leader, right? And great leaders, when you see their organizations, you get the idea that that organization is an embodiment of who they are. Of course, not everybody in the leadership chain can do that, but you get the sense that that a leader, that an organization can run very smoothly. When I first got here, I was just, to tell you a story, I was trying to reach this woman named Cheryl Graves. She does restorative justice stuff, and I just kept trying to reach her. And I called up one day and I just said, "Yo, I'm trying to have a conversation with you, and you won't return my call," and I'm personally insulted, So when I finally got to meet her, she brought a whole group of people with her to say, "Let's go meet this guy. I want to know who he is. Why is he leaving me messages like this?" But they came and they had a conversation with me because they were against building the center that I was building, and in fact got a group of people to go to the police department to say that this center ought not to be built. So I stepped into this confrontational environment to begin with, and I'm already a confrontational guy, so I had to figure out how to deal with this. But I just sat around the table and I said, "This is who I am. This is where I'm from. This is what I'm trying to do. And the first rule for me is to do no harm." Right? And I'm going to try to build a system for kids, but I'm not going to try to hurt them. I'm going to try to treat kids restoratively rather than punitively, right? And because I think what happens in leaderships and community is that John McKnight wrote this beautiful book. It's called the Careless Society, and I suggest anyone who wants to talk about community engagement ought to read this book. And just read the first chapter of it, the introduction, if you read nothing else. Basically, his argument is systems can't care. And in this country, we create systems to go and fix communities, right? And you only see that happening in the poor communities. You don't see that happening in the affluent communities. You don't see people in an affluent community saying, here's a child welfare system, let's say. Let's put it in this community and fix the community, right? So his theory is systems can't care. It's the job of community to care. Any attempt to create a system to fix a problem in community is a counterfeit. And so that's the way I approach the work. Basically, I get people in the community, and people are the community who are interested in doing the work that I do, and I go in and have conversations with them and try to work with them. But if they don't connect with you on a level and they don't think that that you're real, they're not going to work with you. So you have to bring your realness to the table, and you have to bring your passion to the table. Because if they can get your passion and they can see that you're real and you care about them, they'll do anything for you.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, and there were a few points I wanted to just highlight out of that great statement. One is in terms of your boss, that's Mary Ellen Caron,
yeah.
Right? And I would, and I'm hoping the class, as a follow-up to this, will, and class, I'll give you a link on this to look at Commissioner Caron's bio, and I think it's very important to see who she is. She is a tremendous leader, and it's a testament when a person like Azim says great things about you. That doesn't happen very often. So for her to say great things about Mary Ellen Caron, that means a lot, and I want you to see who she is. The second interesting thing that you talk about is this thing that we see in community work a lot, which is that kind of when you first sit down at that table, that distrust. You sit down, you try and sit down with people that have been working hard in in the community for a long time, and you sit down, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're Latino, you sit down, and building that trust seems to be so important.
Man, Bill, that is so huge. You just hit on a major point. And for me, you know, it's like going in an organization and trying to ask an organization for money, right? You know, you want money from them, but the first conversation should never be about money, right? The first conversation with that person should really be about how you doing, getting to know that person. You know, don't even ask for money on the first conversation, because if you do, you're done, right? To me, it's the same thing with communities when you're going to have a conversation. Trust should not be on the table at all, because you can't go in and tell a person to trust you. That's not the way people trust you. People trust you based on a history with them. So what I try to do when I go in and have a conversation with people, I try to be real. I don't always get it right, but I try to be real. And I never say to them, trust me. What I try to do is show them who I am. And I think if they get to that core of who you are, they decide whether or not you're a person they want to trust or not. And the other thing is I think you have to really think about who you are when you go in and have a conversation with communities. What has happened in the past is people in the city and people with power think because they're the 400-pound gorilla in the room, they could just go in and dictate to people, you know, or people, just because you have money, people are going to trust you. You know, well, the Casey Foundation did that, you know. They had a ton of money and they threw it at this issue to try to fix the issue. And we would go and talk to these people, they'd take us on these gatherings, and people would say, we don't like these people at all, but we want their money. You know, so I learned that, you know. I learned that you may have the collateral to get it done, but if you don't have the relationship, you know, to get it done, you know, I coined the saying, looking at the juvenile justice system, because I think this is where the juvenile justice system is failing, you know, is that rules without relationship breeds rebellion. Can't go into community, or you can't go into an organization and lay down all these rules and don't build relationships with people, because they are going to rebel. And if they rebel, the trust is gone. So I don't go in looking for them to trust me. I go looking to tell them, this is who I am at my core. You take me as I am, or you don't.
That's great. And we just finished a unit on relationship management, so that fits perfect, and I'm going to remember that quote. That's a great quote. And I wanted to just also, the third thing I wanted to do out of that little vignette that you gave was talk about a little bit about this specific programmatic issue you've been working with JISC and with your passion for juvenile justice. Tell a little bit about, if you could, to the class about just the organizational context of JISC and how you've been able to kind of get it implemented and what it is and what it stands. JISC stands for
the Juvenile Intervention Support Center. You know, I could probably do a lot better with JISC if I had the time. Part of the problem is the time. But what I did was built an organization in place where kids can get the help that they need. Right? I'm just having an honest conversation, because I think in these conversations you ought to be honest. And if as a leader you can't critique yourself and you can't say you ought to be better, you ought not to be in programs trying to help anybody, you know. And so if I had the time to just sit down and really concentrate on that, I think it could be way better than it is. But I have a person who runs the case management piece that I have faith in. And again, what I've done is just get out the way and let her do the work. And it's worked out really, really well, you know. What
was the vision around?
The vision was, in Chicago, the arrest rate for African Americans are 73%. For Hispanic, it's 19. For whites, it's 7. You can say whatever you want to, but black kids make up 13% of this population, yet the arrest rate is 73%. There's something wrong there, right? And what I try not to do as a leader is try not to talk about race, because I think when you talk about race with certain people in our society, or with white people, they shut down. What I try to say to people is this fundamentally fair? Is it fundamentally fair that the African American population in Chicago is 13%, yet the arrest rate for African American kids is 73%? And you just saw a study that came out in the New York Times the other day that says African American kids are suspended, 3-4 times more than white or Latino kids, right? And by the way, this was happening when crime was dropping. So, crime is dropping, yet the arrest rate continues to climb. So I think that's something that, and what I wanted to do with the GIST is that anybody that knows anything about juvenile detention know that juvenile detention is the gateway to incarceration. If you incarcerate kids in the juvenile detention center, those kids are 13% more likely to end up, 38% more likely to end up in prison, 38% more likely to commit a felony, 38% more likely to be back in juvenile detention. So the idea of the Juvenile Intervention Support Center is to steer kids out of the juvenile detention center and defer them to get help in the community. Again, because systems can't care, it's the job of community to care. So if these kids are being arrested and you're sending them back in the community to get help, rather than putting them in the detention center, they are much more likely to do something with their lives. So that's the idea of the gist. The other thing is MacArthur just did a study on dissidents, and what they found was that if you're in the juvenile detention center, you're much more likely to end up there because you're surrounded by other kids that are bad, and what do you learn? You learn how to be bad. So it's a training ground, you know, to actually educate you for prison.
That's great, and it's a wonderful vision, and you've been able to implement it as a leader. It's always, even though there's always more work to do, when you actually see something happen on the ground. And I've been to JISC and met with the folks, and it is a great model, and it does work. And restorative justice itself is an excellent thing that we all have to focus on as leaders that are focusing on the community and really focusing. One thing I wanted to mention and to highlight is. One of our bonds when we first met was, that I think we both saw that we had a passion for kids and youth. And I think that one of the things is when you're in the community, I think you can sit down at a table and pretty much assess quickly. I talk about rapid leadership assessment. And I think one of the things that you can do is really quickly determine whether a person really has a passion for kids and community and making things happen, versus in it for their own good.
Yeah, I think that's true for anything, but I think what leaders ought not to do is misinterpret people's passion, right? Because you can have a quiet passion and still get things done. You can have a determined passion or a loud passion, and still get things done. So what I try to do is not go in and look at passion, and to define other people's passion based upon my definition of what passion is, right? Because I think sometimes you read people wrong. Some people have a quiet passion and they move mountains, And so what I try to do is really try to figure out what's at the core of what this person believes, And I will say that part of the problem that we face in our country today, is we don't know what good leadership is. I mean, we don't. We elect people to be leaders, but to be honest with you, they all ought to go and take courses in leadership because, we elect them based upon the way that we think. But that doesn't mean that they're good leaders, right? I mean, what politicians do, that's different than what leaders do. They actually go out and find out what you think and build a campaign around that. Leaders are different. What leaders do, leaders listen to you, decide, what you want to get done, and then they advocate for you. Right? That's what great leadership is.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and that's a great lesson learned for this class. I mean, and it's a perfect kind of description of what I'm trying to get the students in this class to realize. So that's a great lesson. One of the things you mentioned was partnering with the schools. And one of the questions that I have for you about community engagement and working with community is how you determine which partners to pull in and how you assess and categorize different types of partners and how you prioritize which ones are the most important to work with. I know that's a tough question.
Yeah. It's a tough question for two reasons. One is I've learned that even if I don't like you, I need to work with you. Right? When I first started this position, I didn't like you, I didn't work with you. But I've surrounded myself with people who have taught me, how to really, really cool down, right? And learn how to work with people if you don't like them. I've never said this before, but I'm saying this now. That's been my biggest struggle, is working with people that I don't like. The other thing too is trying to find people to work with who don't necessarily believe what I believe, And I think that's where leadership is failing in this country, right? I mean, most of the work that we've been able to get done in this country is when we surround ourselves with people who think differently than the way we do, right? Because that's how you learn. If you're in a room and everybody think like you don't learn duck squat. If you're in a room, you know, and people think different than you and they challenge you based upon your belief, that's how you learn, right? So what I've tried to do is work with people who can check me, you know, in my, I'd like to say craziness, you know, because, you know, I had people in rooms and I've said statements and they've said, wait a minute. And that's the person I want to work with. The person who, you know, who is not intimidated by me, who could stop me and say, wait, we don't like what you're saying here. We don't agree with you. Because that adds to my own growth, right? And, you know, I just read a piece on the Supreme Court the other day that says the Supreme Court now, you know, used to be that the people on the Supreme Court took people to clerk with them who taught differently than they did. Now the Supreme Court is so polarized, they have chosen people who actually think like them to clerk for them. So where's the pushback? Where's the debate? You know, and you grow when you leave room for that. So I've tried to do that with community organizations, but I also think everybody is fighting to survive now. No one has time to really, like, you know, push back at you if they don't have funding. You know, so they'll do anything to get your funding and say anything to get your funding and put up with anything to get your funding, you know, because they just want to survive. And when you're in the survival mode like that, there's no room for growth because you don't have time to grow. You're just trying to survive.
Yeah, it's a really difficult environment, and that's one of the things we've been talking about in the class is really how you survive as a small community-based organization in this you know, climate of very difficult financial times and times that we haven't seen in working in the work that we do. I wanted to ask you for, in addition to JISC, I wanted to ask for a couple of other examples of that you could give the class and give me on where you think you saw community engagement really working at its best, or where there were some examples in Chicago where people came together and it actually is working. And you know, I'd be curious to know a couple of other examples from you on
Well,
that.
you worked with me on one expungement, right? I mean, you know, when I first got here, you know, based upon my own experience, and I think another thing about leadership, before I answer this question, is that smart leaders take their experience, you know, that they have gone through in life and walk with it, you know, and talk with it and act with it, you know, and you can't be a leader unless you have ethics and unless you're professional, right? And so expungement for me was one of those things where my experience made me walk with it, because at 17 I got arrested. I was playing basketball in the park. My friends had went into a school and stole, you know, the fire extinguisher and stuff. And so, you know, they ran into the park at night. I'm in there bawling, and the cops came in, and cops didn't care about who was in the school, who was not. Everybody got arrested. So I got arrested for that, and then I got arrested for something else. I don't want to say what, but let's face it to say I got arrested for something I had a right to be arrested for. And so, but, you know, I was 17, and at the time, New York had automatic expungement. If you turned 17, anything you did as a juvenile was automatically sealed and expunged. So I go through that, you know, go through college, go through law school. I take the Florida bar, I pass it, and I had this guy who did the background check for the FBI. He comes in and went to get my confidential expunged record, you know, and writes me a letter telling me, tell me about this arrest. Hey, first of all, it's a juvenile record. It's confidential. Second of all, it was expunged. You have no right to it. So, you know, I was like, man, I worked hard to get here, and this guy is not going to admit me to the bar because of something that I did. That one was confidential, two was expunged, three he was not even supposed to see. So I wrote New York saying, what the hell's going on here? You know, how did he get a hold of this record? So New York wrote him a letter saying, sending him the proof that it was sealed and expunged and telling him it's confidential. He should not and ought not to have even gotten it and should not have looked at it. So at the time when I got here, you know, Illinois had an expungement law on the books, but, you know, there was no definition of what expungement was. You know, you could be upstate and apply a definition of expungement different than being a definition of expungement in Chicago. The other thing was there was no automatic expungement And out of the 20,000 kids that are arrested the year I look at the figures, only 90 applied to have their record expunged. And, I had guys who were calling me up saying, Mr. Ramelize, I got arrested when I was 17, but nothing happened. I didn't go to court. The police didn't do anything with the arrest. I just applied for this job for the Board of Education, and this arrest is showing up. Right? And that should have been expunged. That's unfair. So I decided to start working on the expungement issue. You got involved, and I started calling around organizations saying, look at this expungement issue. So I got hooked up with Enlace. I got hooked up with a ton of organizations in the community, got them to sign on to the legislation. We went before, you were there when we went before the legislature to testify about the expungement bill. And I had automatic expungement in there. Well, the state attorney came out against it, and so did the Cook County state attorney goes, so everybody goes, So the bill failed. So we had to go back at it again. We went back at it again the second time, and the major things that we were trying to get out of it is that, some states transfer all of their records to the federal government. Some states don't transfer juvenile records to the federal government. So that was the first thing I wanted to get out of it. If you're arrested or you're convicted for something that's not murder, that's not jacking up people, that's not beating people over the head, that stuff should not be transferred to the federal government. So in this last session, that was passed, and it's about to become law. So if you have an arrest record, the state police cannot send those things to the federal government. And the reason that is important because once it gets in the federal database, anybody could see it. Federal people will tell you no, but the people who does the background checks for jobs and employment, they don't tap the state records. They go into the federal database to see if you have an arrest record or to see if you have an adjudication of delinquency. The other thing that people don't know and employers don't know is that if you were found to have committed something as a juvenile, it is not a conviction. It's an adjudication of delinquency. It's different than a conviction. And so I don't think the public really know about it. But people got behind us, people supported this law, and it's about to become law, There are a number of things that people have gotten. That's one issue. The other issue people have gotten behind, and I think, we have done a good job, is the restorative justice stuff, Balance and restorative justice is a way you approach people. It's a way you approach kids, And it says that, if a kid doesn't act, you ought to look at dealing with that kid restoratively rather than punitively. The stage that you set for that kid is really, really important as the outcome that you want to get, right? And we're locked into this position in juvenile court where everyone is combative. Very few people talk for the victim, right? And very few people talk for the kid, right? You have the state who talks for the victim, but you have the public defender who really is supposed to talk for the kid, but really, they're talking, to try to get, a conviction either dismissed, overturned, or get the best plea they can. So who's talking to the victim and who's talking to the kid? And restorative justice try to get that conversation happening, Because, there was one incident where this kid, came into to school and was just going ballistic, and they won't, the teachers called the police, they wanted to arrest the kid. Well, somebody took the kid to the office and just sat down and had a conversation with the kid. The day before the kid saw his mother get shot, and so you're going to arrest this kid, but you're not going to have a conversation with him to try to find out, well, why are you behaving this way? Somebody took the time to just have the conversation. And then that put everything else into context, because then you could deal with this kid and you could come of him restoratively because you understand now rather than saying, I'm going to lock you up and send you to detention. So I think having conversations with people is really, really important. I cannot stress the importance of community work when you're a community person dealing with community, and also leadership in really putting your listening ears on and just listening to people. And I find myself doing that a lot more now than actually talking. And that's something I've actually learned from Andre. How you begin to really not jump and be emotional and go after people and just sit down and just begin to think through stuff before you react.
And that's a great example of that. And one of the things that I always talk about is that link to these other social issues to public health. And clearly these juvenile justice issues have a direct linkage to public health because it's the same risk factors. the kids that they're in the cycle of poverty, they're in the cycle of criminal justice, they can't get out of it, and it impacts their health as a person. That creates further health disparities, and it just furthers that cycle of poverty.
I think you hit on something really, really interesting, because I know you think this way, but I don't think when we educate people, we think this way, right? We think we educate people to be a lawyer, but really brilliant lawyers are brilliant social workers, right? And we think we educate people to be in public health, and people see public health as being different than juvenile justice. But really, if the juvenile justice system had taken a public health approach rather than a criminal justice approach, it would be a different system today, right? Because public health, what it does, it brings in all of these different factors to look at what's happening. Criminal approach doesn't do it. It just deals with criminality, right? If you're guilty or not guilty. Public health look at all of the other factors that's affecting you into why you behave that way, right? So race, poverty, economics, all of those things, right? Your health, what you eat, all of those things come into play when you're dealing with public health. And the failure of our educational system is that we parcel out these degrees and stuff about how you ought to think about these issues, and it's a really a major failure. And the other thing is, you can't teach empathy. You got to have empathy for the people you're trying to help, right? Empathy is something you're either born with, you learn it from your parents, you have it or you don't. You can teach somebody how to be sympathetic, but empathy is something that it's a core value that you get growing up. It's one of those things that you have or you don't have. And great leaders have to have empathy. You got to have empathy when you're a leader. And if you don't, for any issue, for even the issue I disagree with George Bush, but I have empathy for him as a leader and some of the issues that we face, because a leader that I actually agree with, Obama, I have less empathy for him because I agree with him. So, it's you learn these things, and you learn you're not always right, and you learn to listen to people who say, shut up, you're wrong,
That's great. And that, that link, that showing that this restorative justice model is really a public health model is such a cool thing, and I'm hoping the students will pull that out as a lesson learned here, because it is community based, and it is children. It's based on the kid and making an impact on that kid. I wanted to ask you a question that, and I didn't prep you for this question, but I wanted to ask you about it, which was, I wanted your impression on that recent meeting, with the gang leaders and the police department. Sorry, but I've been wanting to ask you that, and I didn't want to give you a heads up, man.
Talk about a curveball.
and really,
I had a friend growing up who, it was something interesting that he said. His name is Duop. Kenny Duop is his name. He spent about 25 years in prison and ran prisons. Right? If you know anything about prison, the guards don't run prisons, man. Prisoners run prison. Let's just face it. God keeps people locked up and keep them from getting out. The day-to-day stuff that happened in prison, you got people who run it, and they're usually the prisoners. And Kenny ran prisons in New York. So they would move him from prison to prison because he'd go to prison and take it over, But we were having a conversation now about gangs, because he's out now, he has a family, he's working, and he's really become a productive member of society working with kids. And we were talking one day about street gang, and he said, Azim, if nobody talked about us, we would be nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You get people on the street saying, you see what Kenny Duop did today? Man, it spreads, and everybody begin to think, oh, Kenny Duop, he's such a big man, and I think we have the same problem in Chicago with street gangs. I think we make a bigger issue of it than we ought to, so we give them credit where credit is not due. It's like us fanning the flames almost,
Mm-hmm.
And when you have the chief of police meeting with them, the argument is, I don't know if I agree with it or not agree with it. We can have that conversation off camera. But is that you give them credibility, right? And then to have them stand before the camera and say, give us jobs, it's almost as if they're saying, well, let's bargain. You give us jobs, we want to be street gang members. members, right?
Right.
Gangs are something that have never worked, have never been productive for our kids. You know, I'm a perfect example of that. I'm sitting here, I'll never be able to walk because of my involvement in a street gang. You know, anyone who thinks that being in a street gang is cool ought to have their head examined, because it's not. And we ought not to treat them as if they are, and we ought not to give them credibility. Now, I understand the argument is that in other cities it has worked. The difference between Chicago, when Chicago was approaching when the old Mayor Daley was approaching dealing with street gang, and Mayor Lindsay in New York was approaching dealing with street gang. What Mayor Lindsay did was hire ex-street gang members to go out and do community work with street gang members. And as a result, street gangs died out in New York. I mean, my gang was one of them, because we had ex-street gang members coming and talking to us, counseling us, trying to help us find jobs, and say, man, this is stupid, this is not cool. Nobody's trying to go to prison for life. You want to go to prison and try to be some street gang guy? Are you stupid? The old Mayor Daley clamped down on them, you know, and because he clamped down on them, they went on the ground. And because they went on the ground, they were able to proliferate, right? Mm-hmm. When they went on the ground, you had to learn who they were. They weren't wearing colors that said Black Police Stone Rangers anymore. You know, they were wearing red handkerchiefs or blue handkerchiefs to signify who they are. Then they began to develop the hand signals. You know, this means, you know, you're a member of a certain street gang, you know, and you had all these signs. So then we had to come up to speed because we clamped down on them. We sort of sent them on the ground, and they had to figure out a way to survive. And, you know, when you clamp down on people, there's something to them proliferating. So I think there's something to that. There's been research on it. It says it's the reason that they died out in New York. I don't know the data on the research, but I think there's something to how we approach, you know, members of street gang, and we have to figure that out. You know, and I think, you know, this superintendent is trying, you know, but I don't think, you know, meeting with leaders. And then the street gang as we knew it today don't have one leader. You know, you can be on one street gang in Chicago, you can be in one neighborhood in Chicago, and there are 5 different street gangs on 5 different corners, all within the same communities. So this stuff about leadership, as we think about leadership, one man, you know, making a decision about how to move this, that's done. That's not happening in street gangs in Chicago.
So gangs are almost a model of shared decision making, because
absolutely,
that's interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. More so, too, one of the things you mentioned are these neighborhoods. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, Azim, and I wanted to share this with you, is this concept. And this is one of the things that we're working on in this class is organizational development. Mm-hmm. And we're using community organizations as kind of a model for organizational development. And when you look at Chicago, you have these communities. And they're kind of, even though they're informal, they are formalized by everybody. The research is about the Austin community or the Woodlawn community or the Inglewood community. But what's interesting is that the political boundaries don't follow those neighborhoods. So you've got this whole kind of informal network of communities that people have legitimized and are researching, and yet they don't follow political boundaries. And I just wanted, I haven't had a chance to ask you about this either, but I just wonder your initial impressions of how that impacts on community when you've got this kind of informal structure that's pushing the research and the programs, and then you've got this formal structure that is kind of doing the same thing but almost in competition with each other.
And they're very much in competition with each other. And I think I don't think that's an unhealthy thing, because I think, you know, politicians need pushback, and they need pushback from organic. You know, that's the good thing about what you're describing, is you have these organic, homegrown, you know, sort of institution growing up in our communities, right? And you know, there's this beautiful piece, and I don't have it. I should copy it for you, on psychoanalytical thought. You know, about when you walk into a room, trying to figure out who the leader is in the room, trying to figure out, you know, who the power broker is, trying to figure out who the peacemaker is. That's another thing that I always try to figure out when I walk into a room, because one thing I know about decision making, most decisions when you walk into a room are either made before you walk into the room or after you will leave the room. Very few decisions about what you're going to work on are ever made in a room. You get a room full of people, 9 people. Very few, you know, very few of you can come to consensus on what you're gonna proceed with, right? So as a leader, you have to try to figure out, you know, where these people want to go in the room, and you know, make the decision that you're gonna go left or you're gonna go right, but you're gonna go the way they want to go, but you already make up your mind because you're not going in that room to debate that. Now you can say that's a little bit manipulative, but I can tell you that's the way leadership works. because if you're leading based on consensus, you never get anything done, and that's my opinion. And opinion are like noses; everybody has one, you know. But getting these two bodies to follow each other are never going to happen. What's important is to get the people in the community to begin to push back on what these political leaders think are important, right? And not go their separate ways. Because you can't operate in a vacuum. You know, there have been very few instances of change in our country without politics being involved in it in one way or another. You can argue about the civil rights movement, you can argue about the gay rights movement, you can argue that about Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which I think is a great organization to work with in the way they have structured and been able to get the country to really fall behind them and clamp down on drunk driving. You know, there's an argument to be said that the way they did it in approaching and making it punitive has hurt a lot of people rather than help people, but you know, just the way the movement has blossomed is a thing of beauty, right? It's the same thing for the domestic violence movement, but the domestic violence movement, the failure is, to me, is they have taken this criminal approach to it rather than a public health approach to it. So you see people who are wealthy never being in court for domestic violence unless they murder somebody or something, you know. But you see poor people being affected by domestic violence a lot and going before court and getting arrested and getting prosecuted, right? Because the law either falls on the poor, and it hits it the hardest, the people who can't defend themselves, and the people, you know, in the middle, and the people that are wealthy always get by, right? So I would say it's the same thing for this pushback that we're seeing in our communities, and that's where, to me, the rubber hits the road, and that's where, to me, if we can figure out how to get these two, this organic movement and this political institutionalized movement to work together, we can do something without the anger, right? Because I think the Tea Party is trying to do that, but it's so segregated and so angry, you know, that you don't have the kind of following that you ought to have. And the last thing about that is race matters. You know, it matters in this country. And, you know, we need to have that conversation.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we continue. I put it on the table each and every time because I think it is important to put on the table that race matters. It does, and we've got to keep talking about it. I wanted to get back to one thing. You mentioned a book, and you mentioned the first chapter particular of the book, and I want to make sure that we get that book, the name of it, and I'm going to have my TA.
There's two books. I have a book in my car that I left. It's a book on restorative justice that I think your class really ought to read, and it's all about community engagement and all about doing it restoratively, and it's a really great read. I'm just finishing it now. But John McKnight is the name of the author, and he wrote the book, and the name of the book is The Careless Society.
The Careless Society, right.
And he's arguing about how we have become a careless society. Yeah. And he's gone back and looked at us as a society and laid the argument out for that. And basically what he's arguing for is building strong communities. And, you know, what government does is build systems to fix communities. Yeah. And that's been our failure.
Yeah, that's a great lesson, and I'm going to take that out of here. I always love to talk to you because I always get a lot out of our conversations. I'm going to take that, and I'm going to get the book, but I'll definitely have my TA at least get the first chapter of it, you know, up on the
introduction,
website.
And if you can get that introduction up on the website, it's really huge.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll do that for sure. Yeah. Well, Azim, I want to thank you. It's fantastic to hear your perspectives. I mean, you one of the things I always appreciate about you is that one of the things that good leaders do when they're speaking is they know their audience. And I think you totally understand who, you know, my audience is in this class in terms of, you know, it's a leadership, organizational leadership and public health. And I think the examples you've given have been tremendous, and I think that the students hopefully will take out some very important lessons learned.
The only thing I want to end with is, you know, we've too long looked at public health issues in our country as a joke, you know, as something to be put on the back burner, you know, and we need to move public health to the forefront of the agenda. You have politicians when they talk about issues, you don't hear them talking about public health. You hear them talking about locking up criminals, right? You hear them talking about taxes, but you don't hear them talking about, you know, public health as a way of dealing with all of these issues, you know. And if we did, if we took an approach that you know, probably Sweden takes, let's say, you know, where, you know, Andre and I were talking about this today, 70% of their wealth, you know, 70% of their income going in income taxes, right? I mean, you can argue about that. You know, I'm not going to give 70, but you look at their society, you look at people with medical health, everybody gets medical health, everybody gets a great education. You know, these are things that I think we as a country, if we want to survive, we have to be thinking publicly about health issues. And health is not just whether or not your heart's beating right, or your bladder is working correctly. Health is about your whole well-being, and that's where I think we ought to be going. Yeah. And that's why I think public health need to step up and push their agenda. Great.
And I know that in your bureaucratic role in the Department of Family and Support Services, as an assistant commissioner there, that you look at that partnering with the Chicago Department of Public Health and the other agencies that work on the public health issues as a great partner, and that's important too. And that's a segue into my next unit on local government. So that's a good thing. So.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Great.
Your class is very lucky.
Very lucky. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Welcome.